Drive out past the last row of houses in a lot of American river towns, and you hit a long grass ridge, maybe 15 feet up, running flat to the horizon. It looks like landscaping. It's a levee, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers counts roughly 25,000 miles of them in this country. That ridge is holding a river off your street, and it only works if somebody mows it, inspects it, and digs out the animal burrows before the water arrives. So a levee is not a hill you can build once and forget. It's a maintained machine with moving parts, and the Corps is blunt about what keeps one alive. The embankment itself, the closure structures and gates that seal the gaps where roads and rail cut through, and the pumps and drainage that pull water back out from behind the wall. Every one of those has to be checked, cleared, and operated by a person on a schedule. A gate nobody can find the key to is not a flood defense, which raises the obvious question of what's riding on that maintenance. The Corps puts more than 17 million Americans behind these levees, living and working in the shadow of that grass ridge. Behind them sits over $2 trillion in property value: houses, schools, hospitals, water plants, the substations that keep the rest of it running. That's the payload. Now hold on to the number for how old the machine carrying it is. The average American levee is about 61 years old. That means the typical wall standing between a river and 17 million people was designed for the rainfall records of the early 1960s, and for whatever was downstream of it back then, which was usually farmland and not a subdivision. 61 years is long enough for the water to change, the neighborhood to change, and the people who built the thing to retire and die. It's also long enough for the paperwork to go missing. So, who mows it? Here is where the story stops being about dirt. The Corps built or federally authorized some of these levees, but it doesn't own most of them, and roughly 85% of the miles it tracks are locally operated by levee districts, drainage boards, cities, and in some cases, a handful of landowners with a mower and a checkbook. That's the answer to who's responsible. It depends, and the further down that chart you go, the harder it gets to name a person. Which means the first thing worth finding out about the wall near you is not how tall it is, it's whose name is on it. That wall behind the neighborhood is invisible to you, but it isn't invisible to everyone. After Katrina and Rita tore through the Gulf Coast in 2005, Congress told the Army Corps of Engineers to stop guessing and start writing things down. The Corps built a national levee database, and in 2011 they opened it to the public. So the wall you can't identify does, in a lot of cases, have a file with its name on it, and you can open that file tonight. Here's what's actually in that file, and it's more than a dot on a map. Each entry carries the levee's location and physical attributes: how tall it is, what it's made of, how long it runs. It carries a condition rating, an owner or sponsor, and who holds oversight responsibility for it. And it carries an estimate of the people and property sitting behind that structure, which is the number that turns a dirt embankment into a public safety question. And this isn't a database nobody watches. In April 2025, the Government Accountability Office published GAO 25-107,340, a full review of who is responsible for what across the federal levee portfolio, and the National Levee Database sits at the center of it. That's the receipt, an independent watchdog reading the same record you can pull up on your phone, which means when I say the roles are unclear, that's not me guessing, that's the audit. So, the Corps did the thing we usually beg agencies to do. A disaster killed people, and the response was a permanent, public, searchable record instead of a press conference. Type in your address and you can see the structure, its rating, and the name of whoever is supposed to be watching it. That's real, and it's the reason the rest of this story is hard to talk about, because a record that good makes the empty spaces in it very loud. So the database has a slot for an owner, and that slot is where the whole picture starts to come apart. The ASCE 2025 report card puts it plainly: more than half of the levees we know about are owned and operated by state and local governments, not the federal Corps most people picture. Another slice belongs to private parties, drainage districts, farm co-ops, whoever built the thing decades ago. And then there's the last group, which is the one that should make you sit up. More than 1/3 of the levees in the national inventory have unknown ownership. Not disputed ownership, not shared ownership, unknown. Somebody surveyed that embankment, logged its length, drew its footprint on a map, and then reached the field marked owner and left it empty. Here's why that empty field matters more than it sounds. In the Corps' own system, the owner isn't just a label, it's the hook. Everything else hangs on. The owner is who gets assigned as the data manager, the party responsible for reporting the levee's condition, its inspections, its repairs. So when there's no known operator, there's nobody to assign, and the record just stops filling in. The Army Corps says that when ownership is unclear or unknown, responsibility for managing the data becomes uncertain. That is narrower than saying nobody maintains the levee. The public record does not show a clean assignment for who reports condition and inspection information. The uncertainty in the file is the finding, and it is a question for the responsible local agency. Line those two facts up and you get the real shape of the problem. Roughly half the picture is state and local governments who at least have a name and a phone number, even if the budget is thin. Then a third of it is a blank, and every blank is a stretch of earth holding water back from somewhere with no one required to look at it. That's what you're actually searching for when you go look up the wall near your street, and it's why the answer so often comes back empty. So the National Levee Database is the picture we have. ASCE's 2025 report card puts it at roughly 7,000 levee systems covering about 24,000 miles, and that inventory is real, it's public, and you can open it right now. But every number I've given you so far, the owners, the condition ratings, the inspection dates, only exists for the levees that made it into that file. Which means the honest question isn't how bad the cataloged levees are, it's how much of the country's levee network is even in the catalog. Engineers who study this have put out an estimate, and it's a big one. As many as 100,000 miles of non-federal levees may exist across the United States. Set that next to the roughly 24,000 miles in the database, and the cataloged portion stops looking like the whole map. It starts looking like a corner of it. If that estimate is anywhere close, then for every mile of levee somebody has measured and rated, there could be 3 more that nobody has. ASCE lists about 24,000 miles in the National Levee Database and says as many as 100,000 miles of levees may exist. Those figures describe different levels of certainty, so they do not support a neat multiplier or a claim that every uncatalogued mile lacks an owner. The honest conclusion is that the full extent of the system remains uncertain. Think about what has to happen for a levee to end up in that database. Somebody builds it, somebody reports it, an agency surveys it, and only then does it get a system ID, a condition rating, and a place on the map. A drainage district that raised an earthen berm in 1958 and never filed anything with anyone falls out at step 1, and every step after that never runs. Therefore, the levee behind that town still holds back water, still fails the same way, and simply does not appear. So the gap I showed you earlier gets worse in a specific way. A levee with no owner is at least a levee somebody knows exists, and that's a fixable problem. You go find who's responsible. A levee outside the inventory has no owner to find, no condition rating to be bad, and no inspection to be overdue, because there's no record to hang any of it on. It doesn't show up in a risk map, it doesn't show up in a flood model, and it doesn't show up in a budget until the day it stops working. So we know roughly how many miles the database can see. Here's the harder number. The American Society of Civil Engineers reports that only about a third of the nation's levees have been assessed for the risk they pose to the people living behind them. Not inspected for paperwork, assessed for risk, meaning somebody actually asked what happens to those homes if this wall lets go. For the other 2/3, that question has never been formally answered, which means a levee can be in the database, have a length, have a location, and still carry an unknown consequence. And while that assessment gap sits open, the water keeps testing the walls. Levee researcher Farshid Vahedafard published work on December 29, 2025, pulling together 487 overtopping events across 15 years, cases where the river simply climbed higher than the barrier built to hold it. Overtopping isn't a freak outcome. It's the ordinary way these structures get pushed past what they were designed for over and over in places most of us never hear about. GAO reported that the known levees in the national database average 61 years old. Age alone does not make a structure unsafe, but it raises the value of current condition and inspection information. The neighborhood, rainfall, and development around a levee can change while the embankment remains in place for decades. So, put the two halves together. A 61-year-old structure overtops somewhere in the country roughly 30 times a year, and a 2 in 3 chance nobody has formally scored what it would cost the neighborhood if it failed. That's why the counting problem isn't a filing problem. Every mile we can't rate is a mile where the decision to spend money, or evacuate, or build more houses behind it gets made without the one number that matters. So here's the part that ties the whole thing together. When a levee gets accredited by FEMA, it doesn't just earn a stamp, it changes the flood map underneath it. The land behind that levee gets redrawn out of the high-risk zone, which means the federal requirement to carry flood insurance goes away for everyone with a mortgage back there. The wall didn't move the water, it moved the paperwork. FEMA is not hiding this. The agency has a page written for people who live and work behind levees, and it says the quiet part out loud. A levee reduces risk, it does not remove it. Read it and you'll find the phrase residual risk, which is the polite engineering term for the flood that happens when the wall is overtopped or fails. The page exists because the map does not say that. The map just shows you a shape that isn't shaded anymore. And this is where accreditation stops being a technical detail and starts being a sorting machine. A 2025 study in Environmental Research Letters looked at what actually decides who lands inside a mapped flood zone, and it wasn't how likely the flooding is. It was whether the levee in front of you carries FEMA accreditation. Two neighborhoods with comparable water behind comparable walls can end up on opposite sides of that line, and the line is what sets your premium, your paperwork, and your sense of whether this is even your problem. Now stack that on everything we've walked through. The levees with no clear owner are the ones least likely to have the engineering record accreditation demands. The unmapped miles can't be rated at all. So the people standing behind the least documented walls are the same people the map tells there's nothing to insure against, and when the water comes, they're uncovered because the paperwork said they were safe. Use the National Levee database as a starting point, not a verdict. Locate the nearby system if it is listed, then read the ownership or sponsor information and the condition data that are available. A blank or old field is missing public information, not proof that the wall has been abandoned. Take that question to the levee district, public works office, or emergency manager named by your community. So here's the first of the three things I promised you at the start. The National Levee Database is public, it's run by the Army Corps, and you can search it by address. Type in where you live, and if a levee near you is in the system, you'll get its name, its length, the risk characterization the Corps assigned it, and the sponsor listed as responsible for it. That's the fastest way to find out whether the wall near your street is a levee anybody officially knows about, or just a mound of dirt with no paperwork behind it. Write down 3 pieces of public information if the record provides them: the named owner or sponsor, the condition or risk information, and the date tied to the latest available assessment. A missing field tells you what the public record cannot answer. It does not tell you, by itself, that nobody is watching the levee. Then compare 3 sources that answer different questions. The levee record describes the structure. The FEMA flood map describes mapped flood risk. Local emergency guidance tells you what to do if water threatens the area. None replaces the others, and an accredited levee reduces flood risk without eliminating it. None of that makes the levee stronger. It doesn't fix a rating, it doesn't fund an inspection, and it won't put an owner's name on a wall that never had one. But every failure we walked through in this video started the same way, with a system that nobody outside of it could see, and a public that only found out what it was standing behind after the water was already in the street. 30 minutes on 2 federal websites moves you out of that group. You can't repair the thing, but you can stop being surprised by it. Use the National Levee Database as a public question list. Check whether a nearby system is listed, read the sponsor and latest available risk information, then compare it with your local flood map and emergency guidance. A blank or old field identifies a question for the responsible levee district, public works office, or emergency manager. Keep personal records private. The useful next step is a local public answer, not sending paperwork to this channel.